Good day and welcome to our continued study of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. In case you're new to our study, our others are available online previous weeks, and you can see those through the web page that's shown here, the information that you can obtain there. If you have any questions about us, you can contact us through that. All the information you need is there. Tonight we're in lesson number 8, and we're looking at just 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, you might be thinking that in the past we've done more chapters than that in a setting, but chapter 11 is a pivotal time in the book of 2 Samuel. It's a pivotal time in the life of David, whereas before that things had been going very, very well for him. Beginning with these events here in chapter 11, things are not going to go so well. In fact, David is going to experience a great deal of troubles. So we want to spend plenty of time looking at that and understand what it was that caused this particular change, this pivotal point in David's life. So if you'll keep your Bibles open to 2 Samuel chapter 11, that's all that we'll be looking at. As we've done previous times, here is our basic outline. Tonight you can see chapter 11 covers the sin that David committed, first the sin of adultery, later the sin of murder, and then continuous attempts, schemes, strategies whereby he could hide his sin. And for the extent of chapter 11, he's basically successful in that. But when we get to chapters afterwards, we'll find that, of course, he's not going to be free of the consequences of what he has done. So with that in mind, let's look at chapter 11, which we call David and Bathsheba, because that's basically the story, even though some other characters are involved. Just one chapter, but again, a chapter filled with events that influenced things to come in the book of 2 Samuel. We begin with chapter 1, or verse 1 of chapter 11. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. We're reminded here of a principle of ancient warfare, still true in modern times to some extent, depending upon the equipment being used. But in those days, an army had to wait for certain times of the year in order to be effective in traveling and preparing themselves for a battle. This was the spring of the year. The weather was no doubt more susceptible for the traveling and the battle that was going to take place. And so that's what David's army did. And we notice here that when kings go out to battle, so it seemed to be to at least some extent that when you send the whole army out, it was likely that you as a king would also send out or go out with the army. And David did not do that. He sent Joab, who was the longtime supporter of David and the commander of his army. Why he did that, we are not told. There may be nothing to learn from that. It may be an absolute innocent reason that he felt like he did not need to accompany them. But as you look back upon it, I'm sure he would have said it would have been better if I had been with Joab and the army. But he sends Joab out, and he remains at Jerusalem, and he attacks the people who were constant enemies of Israel, known as the Ammonites, the people of Ammon, the text says, and besieged a city called Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Now we'll look here at some maps that show us a little bit about the location here. You see Jerusalem. You see all the different directions that David and his forces had gone out before and had been very successful in conquering, subduing, and making servants out of those countries that they were victorious over. We looked at these a little bit more closely last time in our study. But this particular time, he crosses over the Jordan, or his army does, into the land of the Ammonites on the east side of the Jordan River. And this would be where the battle would take place, in a city known as Rabbah. And before we focus in on that in a little larger scale, I want you to notice this map here in which we see the kingdoms of Saul, which was somewhere in the category of an orange-brown color, the territory which David was able to conquer, which included the blue territory on this map, and then the green, the territory that Solomon, his son, would later on add to the kingdom. And when Solomon did that, he would fulfill the promise that was made to Abraham long before this, that Abraham's descendants would have a nation, they would control this land. Abraham was in the middle of it during one of the promises when it was renewed, but it would go all the way from the river of Egypt down to the lower left of this map, all the way up to the river. It would have been called the Euphrates, such a great and remarkable river. It was just called the river, and then over to the Great Sea, the Mediterranean. So Solomon would soon do that. David would expand from what Saul had conquered. And within this territory that the Ammonites held, we have this city named Rabbah. And that's where Joab took the armies of Israel, the army of Israel, and attacked there. And in the long run, he was going to be very successful in doing that. Let's move on to verse 2, and we see what happens when David is back at the palace rather than with his army around the city of Rabbah. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. And we're going to look in just a moment at a view of what houses might have looked like back then. I think will help us to understand this. But let's notice the situation first. We have David walking upon the roof of the king's house, the palace, or attached to the palace, probably one of the taller buildings in Jerusalem. That's the way it would be for people who were kings, probably overlooking the rest of the territory. And that he saw a woman bathing. Now, without trying to justify David in the least, because certainly David was totally guilty in this as the events continue to happen, but we also have to wonder about Bathsheba and exactly the role that she played. Because obviously, if David on the roof could see her, then it should have been possible for her to look and see David, or to at least know that someone could have a vantage point there and see what was going on. So perhaps, and we don't know this, but perhaps Bathsheba was guilty on the other side of assisting the lust that David felt, or perhaps she was just careless in this situation and allowed it to happen. But either way, she was certainly not totally unwilling in this participation of the events that took place. Now here, as we look at the type of house that people might have built back then, you can see that many activities took place upon the roof. The roofs were places of economic work and other things, including sometimes bathing, to go up on the roof and in situations where it was hidden and it would be a private place for personal hygiene things. We also see in the middle of the house that's shown here as an example, that down in the center there's a court area. And that also was a place that sometimes people would take care of their personal needs, such as bathing. And we don't know exactly where in the whole picture that Bathsheba might have been. She might have been in either place. But again, we do know that it was a place that was visible to David, and therefore it would have been, or could have been certainly, something that Bathsheba knew was visible to David as she bathed there. But those were the events that started a series of very tragic events that follow both in this chapter and also in the chapters that come later. So after David had seen her, here's what's said in verse 2, or verses 3 and 4. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him. And he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. Now, we know and we realize the tragedy of the fact that David could have stopped long before this point. Even though he had this view on the top of his roof as he looked down and he saw a beautiful woman, he could have stopped it right there. So much grief would have been saved, but he did not. He inquired about that woman. He learned who she was. And because he was king and could do it, he sent for her. He pursued the desire that he had. We notice here that as far as we can tell, and there's certainly nothing here very obvious about any kind of objection, there doesn't seem to be resistance on Bathsheba's part. Now, someone could say, well, she was only complying with an order of the king. And that's not impossible. But on the other hand, the language here, and certainly the inspired writer of this particular part of the Old Testament, certainly could have said and perhaps would have said something if any of this had been against the will of Bathsheba. It seems to be that she was compliant with the king's request and desires, and nothing is said otherwise within the text. Now, at some time after this, we learn of the consequences of David's sin. This one-time event, one night of lust being carried away, the consequences of it. The woman conceived, that's Bathsheba. So she sent and told David and said, I am with child. Then David sent to Joab, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah the Hittite. When Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war prospered. So notice here, plan number one, to escape the consequences of his sin, to cover it up, to hide what was the obvious outcome of the sin that David and Bathsheba committed. And it was to bring Uriah home from the battlefield, to go and be with his wife. And then in that case, the fact that she would be with child at some later point would perhaps not be of interest to anyone. Perhaps no one would notice, and David would be able to escape any accusations or any hints of his involvement in this. So plan number one, he sends a messenger, Joab, send Uriah home, and then he engages Uriah in a conversation. It's a very perhaps expected conversation. Would not be necessary for someone like Uriah to be the messenger, but perhaps not too unusual. And so David just makes conversation about how things are going. How is Joab? How are the people? How is the war going? Are we winning or are we not? So he does this, it would seem most likely, in order to make this seem like a normal thing that he did in bringing Uriah back home from the battle and back to Jerusalem where his house was. Now, after this, David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Now, that would not be something that meant simply go there and clean off his dirty feet, but rather it would be suggestive of going down there and enjoying your home for a while, resting up some because you've been working hard. It would have been taking advantage of the hospitality of being home. That's the idea of wash your feet. So at this point, apparently Uriah doesn't say, no, king, I couldn't do that. However, he does, in the long run, refuse to do that. So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. In other words, David was trying to make it as easy as possible for Uriah to be at home, to relax for a little while, and to relieve David of the consequences of his act. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Now, if we hadn't read any further, we might think, why would Uriah do something like this? but we find out later exactly why when David asks him why and says, once again, you need to go to your home and you need to rest. But Uriah does not do that. He slept where the king's servants were and did not take advantage of the pleasures and the conveniences of being in his own house. Well, word gets back to David. So when they had told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Well, here's plan number 2. He's attempting to convince Uriah that it's perfectly normal for him to go down to his house. He's come from a long journey. It would be a long journey from the area of the Ammonites back to Jerusalem. He would be tired. He'd been involved in battle. He'd been sleeping the way soldiers sleep without any niceties for a period of time during this time of battle. And so to many, it would make sense. Yes, I ought to go and rest and recover from this long journey, build up my strength, and be ready to go back and fight again. So that was David's second plan, to convince Uriah that he deserved this. However, that did not work. As we continue reading, we find that Uriah was much more noble than David was about this whole situation. And Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Now, in saying all of this, Uriah was not being disrespectful to David. He was simply pointing out to David his loyalty to his fellow soldiers and to his commander and to the cause of the Lord. And he said, this would be wrong. I have no right to rest, no right to engage in pleasure, no right to have it easy for a while my fellow soldiers are back there and they're not only battling, but in between battles, they don't have an opportunity for these things that I can have here. And so, Uriah sort of makes the pledge, I'm not going to do this. I just couldn't do it. So we get to plan number 3. David is determined that somehow he's going to use this situation to relieve him of guilt. As we continue, David says to Uriah, wait here today also, and tomorrow I will let you depart. In other words, Uriah, you don't need to go back right now. You don't need to rush. Even if you aren't going to go down to your house, you still need to, be here with me. We'll have a good meal. You'll rest a little bit. And that's what Uriah did. This was David's plan number 3, to literally get Uriah drunk. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now, when David called him, he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. The first he is David, the him Uriah. That was David's goal, because when someone is intoxicated, they do things they otherwise would not do. He was hoping, no doubt, that Uriah would forget the pledge that he made, that I can't go down and be in my house and be with my wife when my fellow soldiers are on the field. Maybe if he was intoxicated, he would forget that. And at evening, he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of the Lord, and he did not go down to his house. So David's plan, no doubt, was to, if he couldn't turn around Uriah's conscience by reasoning with him, he would turn around his conscience by causing him not to be able to reason as well. To be intoxicated and to do that, which literally would go against his conscience, but because of being in that state, he perhaps would not realize that. Well, plan number 3 for David did not work either. And so David was obviously getting a little bit nervous, a little bit desperate, and his desperate thinking resulted in another tragedy. He'd already sinned, and now he's going to compound that sin as he tries to cover up the sin in the first place. And plan number 4 is going to involve the death of Uriah. Beginning in verse 14. In the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab. Joab, remember, the commander of the army. He had to do whatever David said, and he would have to keep it to himself. He was a keeper of secrets here. He would have known something was going on, and probably at some point he understood exactly what was happening here and what King David was trying at a later date. He wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat from him that he may be struck down and die. In other words, it's purely premeditated murder on David's part that he was going to accomplish at the hand of Joab, the king of his army. And so he made Joab an accomplice in this. Now, Joab would no doubt understand this was something that was wrong, but Joab had been loyal to King David for a long time, and perhaps reasoning with himself, if David didn't command this, didn't have a good reason, he would not have commanded this. Remember, Joab knew a David who was very conscious of the Lord's will. A David who on two very clear occasions could have killed King Saul, and said he would not do it because Saul was God's anointed. He saw a man who truly did, as he's described later, be a man after God's own heart. So he perhaps thought there was a justifiable reason for this, but whatever the case, he became an accomplice as he accomplished the death of Uriah, just as King David had told him to do. So it was when Joab besieged the city that he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew there were valiant men. In other words, he did about what David told him to do. He put him in a place where the battle would be fierce, people were going to die, and it would be most likely that Uriah would be one of those people who would die. Then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab. And so it was a sign of a place of great battle, a place where valiant men were coming to defend their city. It was a place where Uriah could easily get killed. And some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. So David tried 3 plans that were not successful. He tried to allow Uriah just to go to his house. He tried to change his mind about his right to go to his house. He tried to get him intoxicated to go to his house. When all of that failed, he chooses this last terrible method. And with the assistance of Joab, he's able to kill Uriah. And we'll see in just a few verses later why it worked out where David at least thought he could continue hiding his sin with Uriah out of the picture. So now it comes time for a report to be sent to David. Joab is no doubt knowing that David wants to hear what's going on, wants to see if his order has been carried out. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war and charged the messenger. And of course, this was what Uriah had done before, although Uriah was not just a messenger, he was brought to Jerusalem for a reason on David's part. But now it's going to be a messenger that takes word back to the king, something which would be done perhaps several times during the course of a battle or several battles, which were going on here in the country of the Ammonites. So he tells the messenger, saying, when you have finished telling the matters of the war to the king. He knew that the king was going to be upset about losing soldiers, about any degree of being defeated. But he also knew that the fact that he had done what the king told him to do would please the king. And in fact, since Joab knew the truth, David would have very little choice but to go along with this and just to understand that, yes, Joab did what I told him to do. There were some things in the process that may have not been best, but he accomplished what I asked him to do. So David or Joab gives the messenger a special message to reply if the king is upset. He said, if it happens that the king's wrath rises, and he says to you, why did you approach so near to the city when you fought? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? In other words, this is the part that David was either angry about or at least pretended to be angry about. And either one of those could be the case. We aren't sure. We aren't certain if David was sincere or he was trying to make the whole appearance here look like it normally would because some soldiers had been lost. So Joab gives the messenger the right thing to say. He continues. This is David's talking about his displeasure. He asked the messenger, who struck Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Was it not a woman who cast a piece of a millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you go near the wall? Then you shall say, well, let's stop before we go on to what you would say. Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth. Now, Jerubbesheth is another name for Gideon. Personally, I like the name Gideon better. It's easier to pronounce. But anyway, this is Abimelech. He was one of many, many sons of Gideon. And he forced himself into the role of leadership after Gideon's death, back during the time of judges who led and made decisions over Israel and sometimes delivered them from their enemies. He took over as the judge, self-proclaimed. In fact, he killed the rest of his 70 brothers so that he would not have any competition for that role. Of course, a very, very horrible thing in itself. We see from what the Old Testament tells us that Abimelech was an undisciplined man, a man that mistreated his own people. Of course, we've already said he killed his other 70 brothers, and he claimed rule to be the next judge. He was not a nice person. Well, in the course of battling in the role of a judge, he was in a battle at Thebez, and a woman did throw a rock or a piece of a millstone down from the wall. That was one way of defending the walls of a city. Anything that struck someone that was heavy enough would certainly hurt them. And Abimelech was killed. So David is saying to the messenger, didn't Joab know that things like that are going to happen? That people are going to throw things down when you're that close to the wall of the city? People are going to get killed. Didn't Joab know that? So the messenger has been told to say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. And that, of course, would, for the most part, end the discussion. It's sort of like, well, things like that do happen in battle, but it happened to Uriah the Hittite. And of course, that's what David wanted to hear. And Joab knew that that would be the right answer. And if David was angry, that would help him to be satisfied. So the messenger went. We've been reading what the messenger was told to say, the expected conversation that would take place between David and the messenger. Joab sends him, so the messenger went, and he told David all that Joab had sent him. In other words, he delivers this message just as King David had said, and the conversation is a whole lot like what Joab said it would be. The messenger said to David, surely the men prevailed against us and came out to us in the field. This is the one particular battle there at the city of Rabbah. There were, as far as we can tell, a number of other battles during the times they were in the country of the Ammonites. Then we drove them back as far as the entrance of the gate. The archers shot from the wall at your servants, and some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger was perhaps honestly conveying something that he thought David would be sad about. You know, here's Uriah the Hittite. He lives right here in Jerusalem. You know his house. His house is not far from the palace. And he died too. He was one of the ones that was killed by the archers. So perhaps the messenger seemed to know nothing about this, expecting David to be sad, and whatever emotions David may have showed, the truth was he was pleased because this was his goal in the first place. So David had no justification for blaming Joab in this case. Joab makes it clear through the message and perhaps through conversations later that what happened was exactly what David wanted to happen. So here's the message that David is going to send back then to Joab. Then David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it. So encourage him." In other words, David's message back to Joab is, don't worry about this. People get killed in battle, and we don't always know who's going to get killed. We can't always control who's going to get killed. So do not be upset over this. And so he was giving Joab the message that he didn't have anything to worry about. He had done what the king told him to do, and that was going to be the end of it. But now as we come to the very last two verses of the chapter, we find that in the long run, it was not going to be the end of it whatsoever. David hoped it was. Joab probably hoped, now this is over, this is done with, but the consequences were far from done with. Here's what happened after the messenger is sent back to Joab. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. She put in the proper time that was supposed to be for mourning. And no doubt there was, as far as we know, some genuine mourning taking place there at the loss of her husband. We don't know for sure what her relationship with him would have been, positive or negative, but she went through the mourning process. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So David does not tarry in doing what he needs to do to again finish up his plan number 4, the plan to cover up his sin. He marries Uriah's wife right away, hoping no doubt that the timing would not be noticed by anybody, and everybody would simply assume it was his child who came at the appointed time after they'd already been husband and wife, without revealing his sin involving her and Uriah the Hittite. But we notice the very last sentence here, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. That is basically going to be the watchwords for the next several events in the next chapter and even beyond. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And that's why we call it the turning point in David's life. He had not only sinned by being with Bathsheba, but he had also sinned in trying to cover it up. And he had sinned in the ultimate way, as far as cover up, by having her husband killed so that he could perhaps hide the guilt of the sin that he had committed. And yet he certainly had not hid it from God. Most likely there were many, many people who were going to figure it out and know that what he had done, and he really had not hidden it from people either. But certainly God knew, and he was displeased. And we're going to see the consequences of that when we begin chapter 12 of 2 Samuel at our next study. So again, here is our page. If you'd like to contact us, look at the other lessons on 1st or 2nd Samuel, whatever your needs might be, we encourage you to do that. Thank you for being with us once again.